Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers.
On this episode, we are discussing the Korean zombie film Train to Busan, and then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query. You can support the podcast on Patreon, where you can read the queries we critique, plus get lots of other bonus content, including monthly writing chats with Carly and me, and the most adorable Story Chat Radio stickers. I absolutely love them. It's easy to find. Just go to patreon.com/storychatradio.
All right, here come the spoilers. A chemical leak at a biotech plant creates zombies. Fund manager Suk-woo is a cynical workaholic and divorced father. His daughter, Suan, wants to spend her birthday with her mom in Busan. Overcome with guilt, he decides to take her via an early train. Other passengers include a working-class man and his pregnant wife, a selfish COO, a high school baseball team, and a homeless stowaway, among others. As the train departs, an infected woman runs aboard and attacks an attendant, and many people are quickly turned into zombies. The survivors notice the zombies only attack if they can see them or hear them, but they can't open the doors. They learn from news reports that this is rapidly spreading across the country. The train stops at a station supposedly secured by the army, and the passengers disembark into a vacant station, but find the soldiers are all zombies. Several passengers make it back safely, but are separated into two groups, one in the front car and the other in the back. The captain learns Busan is a safe zone and takes the train in that direction. The group in the rear car make their way to the front by fending off the zombies. When they finally reach the front car, the other survivors believe the group is infected and block the door. The dad-to-be gets bitten and stays behind so the others can break through. The other passengers force Suk-woo's group into a closed vestibule to keep them separated. The zombies get into the car and kill the other survivors, though the COO managed to escape into a restroom. An out-of-control train causes them to derail, trapping Suk-woo, Suan, the pregnant woman, and the homeless man under the derailed train car. The captain starts another train, and the COO escapes the restroom, pushing other survivors, including the captain, into the zombies to make his getaway. Under the derailed train, the homeless man sacrifices himself so the others can escape. They board the train and discover the infected COO. Suk-woo struggles with him and is bitten before he can throw the zombie off the train. Suk-woo says his farewells to Suan and throws himself off the train. The pregnant woman and Suan, the only survivors, stop at a blocked train tunnel just before Busan and walk through the tunnel, where soldiers rush over and help them to safety. Jenny, what did you think about the movie?
So this is really not my kind of movie.
Yeah.
But I really liked it. I was actually really pleasantly surprised by how much I liked it. I really didn't expect to like it at all. Or at least, minimally. I just thought it would be like any other action horror type movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mind horror movies, but I typically like a slower pace and ghosts. I have very specific criteria for my horror movies. So having said that, this movie was so freaking intense. I watched it on a Tuesday night after dinner and had a hard time getting to sleep hours later because I was still so wound up. And it wasn't that it was especially scary. It is really gory, which doesn't really bother me. But the pacing is just nonstop, super intense once it gets going. I think one of the things that really makes it stand out for me from other horror action films is the character development for Suk-woo, who's the main character. There was this really clear theme here about capitalism, a lot like Parasite, really. And Suk-woo being the main character, he's pretty young, and we see that he's really torn between his career and his family. And the movie really provides like several foils for him, almost like a cartoon angel and devil on his shoulder. So like the working class dad to be and the homeless man are very much like the angels. They end up sacrificing themselves for others. While the COO is clearly the devil, like literally pushing other people into the zombies so that he can get away. And I swear that man was like a cockroach, like just could not be killed no matter how hard,
I was so happy when he got bitten and was dying. I was like, yes.
Finally. And he was really behind, a lot of the bad stuff that happened anyway. So not like the zombie apocalypse or anything, just the stuff on the train car. So yeah, as Suk-woo interacts with these other characters, he's really seeing for himself that his priority is really his daughter. And we see how he solidifies that by sacrificing at the end to save her. So I did really struggle with the depiction of women in this movie, though. They were all just like really stereotypical and didn't really contribute much to the plot aside from being kind of motivation for the men. That was really my biggest criticism of it. And I think in general, it was pretty predictable, but I think the character development is what really stood out for me as being just, really next level for this kind of movie.
Yeah, I agree. I think as soon as I finished the movie, I texted you and I was like, all the women are like the stereotypes. It's like they're either children, pregnant, or very, very old. And it felt too cliche of that whole like child mother matriarch stereotype for women. And they were just basically pure plot devices.
Right.
But that being said, I did actually very much like the movie. I agree it was fast-paced gore. I don't mind gore as much either. But ghosts and slower pace sound awful to me. So we will not be doing that. So vetoing it right now.
Come on, there's some really good movies like that.
I'm sure.
We're going to watch all the gothic horrors.
But if you ever want me to sleep again, we shouldn't. I'll be so dead, and when we record those podcast episodes, I'll just agree with everything you say, and that's not
You can blame The Shining for that, because I think that was the first like real horror movie that I saw as a kid, like at a friend's house late at night on like HBO.
And that didn't turn you off of them?
Nope.
Yep.
No, I went home and started reading the book.
I mean, I like that the horror movies we have watched have been zombie ones. Zombies don't bother me.
Yeah.
Or like monstery kind of apocalyptic stuff.
But not ghosts.
But not ghosts. We are not watching
those are the only
ghosts.
ones I like.
We're not doing it. Unless it's like cartoon animated ghosts. Like we could do more Studio Ghibli ghosts. That's okay.
I don't think that's horror.
I didn't say it was.
Anyway,
just saying, those
what
are
else did you think?
I forget. What is this movie? Okay. No, I really like Suk-woo and his arc too. I thought it was a really good, interesting growth to see during a zombie apocalypse.
Yeah.
But I was kind of like, what now for his daughter? Like, she's clearly not gonna be okay after this. And I feel like...
Yeah, you do have to wonder, like, what is the state of, like, therapy and counseling in a zombie apocalypse?
Yeah, like, how do we handle, like, getting her on the right meds? Like, yeah. Well, and also, like, maybe it was just me, but I feel like her mother is also dead because he tried calling her a lot and got no answer.
And the grandmother.
And, well,
so, like,
the grandmother's
at the beginning of the movie, they're living with his mother.
Yeah.
And she calls and,
dies.
It sounds like she dies on the phone with them.
Dies on the phone.
So, it sounds like she's pretty much without adults to take care of her.
Yeah, she's with
Someone did tell me, though, I was talking to someone else who had told me they had seen this movie, and they said that the daughter is the main character in the sequel.
Oh, so that's cool.
You could watch the sequel, apparently, and find out what happens to her.
Well, that makes me feel better. But yeah, I mean, otherwise I assume she ends up with the pregnant woman who is also traumatized. Yeah. Right. So, like, it just seems like a bad situation all around. But it is a horror movie, so I guess that makes sense.
Right.
So I enjoyed it. I felt like it focused a little too much on like the male gaze, that the female characters become stereotypes and plot devices without any kind of thought put into them. But otherwise, I thought it was really solid, and I do like zombie movies. I think they're fun.
Yeah.
All right, so Jenny, what's something this movie does well that writers can use in their own work?
Ghosts. No, I'm just kidding.
No!
There were no ghosts in this movie. So if you, like Carly, are scared of ghosts, this movie should be safe. Okay, so one really essential element in this story is setting. It would be really hard to tell this same story in another setting. And I think that's part of what has made audiences like this movie so much, is that, you know, it's a slightly different take on a zombie film, but the setting makes it different than a lot of others.
Yeah.
So in horror, a sense of isolation can really help build that tension and keep the audience hooked. And I think this movie definitely does that sense of isolation really well. And I think it's a really interesting case because you don't really think of public transportation as being isolating. Like the train in this case is like a commuter train that, you know, people just take like from one city to the next. It's not necessarily like intended for long distances. And I think normally public transportation is sort of portrayed as the opposite, sort of this crush of people, everyone in close quarters. But the story really relies on that feeling of isolation, even kind of among other people. So this train both takes the passengers away from the area where they attacked and it isolates them from the rest of the world. In some ways, that's a good thing because, like, being isolated means that the zombies that are, like, quote unquote out there can't get them. But they also can't get to like their family and friends and colleagues and communities. So it creates this really odd balance of like safety and fear that feels really dissonant for the viewers. Similarly, as the story progresses, the characters act less and less as a group or a team and more as individuals, which means that each of the characters that the story follows really becomes increasingly isolated from the group as well. I noticed that sense of isolation, even when they stop at the stations and they have those like big open spaces, the space that's there, they don't have on the train, but it's like so eerie to see all of those areas that would normally be teeming with people are now completely empty. And that emptiness really creates that like crushing feeling of its own. So yeah, having this as a modern story also means that the passengers are getting live updates from like the television that's hanging up inside the train cars and like showing the news cycle on it and also on their phones. There's like a scene that just shows everybody with their heads down looking at their phones where they're like texting people and watching news and getting updates about how the zombie apocalypse is growing all over the country. And again, it really adds to that tension and sense of urgency. And like, that just wouldn't be the same if it was set in like the 70s where the news cycle wasn't so immediate and constant. So yeah, I think the movie definitely does setting really well and is a really great example of how setting can impact the overall story.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so what are the different elements of setting? We all kind of think we know exactly what setting is. It's the stage that the story takes place on. But when looked at as like the creator of the setting, you'll kind of quickly realize that there's even more to consider than you thought. So there's the obvious element of setting is the place. It's where your story is taking place. I'm going to be using the word place and setting a lot, and I am regretting everything. Anyway, but you also need to consider what time your story is set in. Oh boy, yeah. Setting, place, taking place. Oh boy. Oh God. All right. I hope everyone.
These words are going to lose meaning by the time we're done with.
They've already lost the meaning. Anyway. All right. So setting it 200 years ago is vastly different than today. So the next you want to kind of consider the culture of the setting. Does your story take place in a certain part of the world with a specific culture? What subcultures within that location does your story touch on? I mean, in a very broad sense, or maybe it's a minuscule sense, I don't know. culture permeates all the way down to how you interact with your friends, your family, your coworkers. So your office has a work culture, your favorite hobby has a social culture, etc. It goes beyond the typical cultures we as a society think of. So in that sense, this culture becomes a setting for your story. So ask yourself how these different elements are going to feed into your story and the setting. So while you have setting, and it seems like an overarching element in your story, when you narrow in on kind of the small stuff, you'll find that it will also change from scene to scene. So basically, I want you all to think of setting as like a tree map. At the bottom, or is it the top? I always forget. Anyway, at the bottom, let's say, you have the time and kind of overall broad location for your entire story. Then from there...
Right, so like this movie is set, like it came out in 2016, so it's essentially modern day.
Modern day.
And it's set in South Korea.
South Korea, exactly. And then you kind of want to narrow in on the small stuff. So you'll find that that is going to kind of change from scene to scene for the most part. So as we narrow in, this play takes place in a major city. I forget. I know we're going to Busan, but I forget where the city.
Yeah, I don't remember the beginning city either.
Anyway, and then it further in, it takes place on a train. And then we have all the different cultures of like the capitalism is affecting this, his financial priorities, his work-life balance, all of that kind of stuff is coming into play on this train and on the setting. So you then want to break it down kind of scene by scene. So where is the most effective place for each scene to take place? Well, how do the different cultures at work in your story affect the scene? So in this movie, as Jenny said, takes place mostly on a single train. People begin the story by giving each other a lot of space because that's kind of what you do with strangers on a train. It's that kind of traveling culture, so to speak. But as the story progresses and the zombies overtake the train, we feel the characters being forced into smaller and smaller settings. So at one point, 4 characters get stuck in a teeny tiny train bathroom, which
I can't even imagine.
I don't think is possible. That was one of my criticisms. I was like, I don't think that's a thing that can happen, but okay.
Well, one of them was a child, so it was a very small person.
Sure. So the setting literally gets smaller to kind of reflect their sense of isolation and how limited they are, how little power they have as the zombies increase. And then even when we have those large open spaces that Jenny mentioned, they should feel freeing, but instead they enforce kind of a different kind of isolation. So yes, they have all this room, but it becomes super apparent that they're all alone. They're completely abandoned. So these different settings affect the viewer in different ways. It evokes different emotions and reactions from the viewer that you want to enact in your readers, basically.
Right.
So it's a super powerful tool to kind of emphasize emotions and feelings in your reader, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true. Ideally, setting should really provide both limitations and also unique opportunities for your characters. And that means all your characters. So like the protagonist, the antagonist, secondary characters. So for example, the characters in this movie had choices because of the modern time period and because of the location in South Korea. So like in my hometown, there really isn't any public transportation. So like getting on a high-speed train to escape from zombies would not be an option. The characters use their cell phones to communicate with each other and with people who aren't on the train. Consider how that might be different if the setting had no cell signal, which is a common trope in these kinds of stories that this story more or less actually avoids.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically I spent this whole movie thinking about the differences of the city folk and us country people. And how that would be different in zombie apocalypse. So in your writing, you want to make sure that you're considering the positives, the negatives, and the neutrals given to your characters because of their setting. The best stories, though, really go deeper than just thinking about time and location. Like Carly mentioned, they also think about the culture of the society where the story takes place and how that culture treats people like each character. So, for example, I mentioned the theme about capitalism, which is like hitting the reader over the head with it in this movie. It's not subtle at all. At one point, the dad-to-be calls Suk-woo a bloodsucker because he's a fund manager.
Which, by the way, super rude to say that to his daughter. Just like,
I know.
Why?
Right?
Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Well, that was kind of his personality anyway. He was kind of like
true.
a very blunt kind of person.
Yeah.
I think that was probably part of like separating him as being working class too. So he and it creates this divide between these two really important characters. And really like Suk-woo's career does give him advantages and context the others don't have, which he tries to use to secure safety for himself and his daughter and not really any of the rest of them. These are definitely elements of the culture that this story, like a story set in another place or another location, might not afford him. So in your writing, really think about the multiple identities of each character. So those identities would be like gender, race, class, religion, etc. For fantasy and science fiction, that can also go into things like different kinds of extra abilities. So whether that's like magic or, different alien species having different functionalities, like that kind of thing. So think about all of those things when you're thinking about the setting, the location, the culture, all of that stuff. So for each of those identities, there are going to be advantages, disadvantages, and then some neutral elements provided to that particular group. So any one character is going to have multiple of these advantages, disadvantages, and then just neutral elements. How do those impact your character? How your character thinks about themselves and their place in the world. How does it affect the choices the characters believe that they have to make? Not even necessarily the ones they actually have, but the ones they think they have. How does it affect the resources that they have access to? So like I mentioned, Suk-woo had these resources that others didn't because of his social status. How does it make characters feel about the other characters and other groups? And just keep going down that path and brainstorming all the ways that setting impacts your characters. And it will create this link between your characters and your story that means the story really couldn't be set somewhere else and still happen the way it does.
Yeah, exactly. So setting should impact plot in very, very strong ways in your story. So kind of just building on what Jenny said here, what are the limitations and advantages of your setting and how can you utilize that to further create conflict? So one of the main setting limitations in this movie are, I would say, basically the doors between each train car.
Right.
So each car is kind of a small world unto itself. It's its own individual setting, basically. And the characters must pass through each new world and come up against different challenges. There's one door in and one door out of each train car, and each car is filled with different conflicts. This movie is actually a really perfect example of how setting should impact plot. So good job picking the topic, Jenny. Like, woo, nailed it. The more I'm talking about it, I'm like, ooh, this is a good example. And oh my God, this is like an analogy for it. Anyway, good job. So, I'm going to use the scenes where the three men are trying to save their families and reach the safe train car at the opposite end of the line. So each scene, for the most part during this section, takes place in a new train car. So as the characters enter a new car, they kind of survey the different antagonists and problems that they're going to have to face. They have to figure out what kind of conflict they're up against and how they can overcome it. So one train car is fairly empty, while another is full of their former friends turned zombies. Each car presents a slightly different setting that then informs on the conflicts the characters must face. So each car presents different limitations that force the characters to think creatively and tackle each challenge differently. If all the cars had the same setting that never changed, then each problem would be solved in the same way. We'd lose interest. We would lose the internal conflict of coming up against your friends that are dead, and if you can attack them with a baseball bat or not. And we come up against...
Yeah, like there was the one train car that was all full of the dead baseball players. And there was only one baseball player who was still alive. And he's with this group that's traveling through. And as he gets into that car and like, they're like, okay, let's do this thing. And, you know, we're almost there and let's do it. And like he looks and it's all his friends.
Yeah.
And they're all teenagers. He's just a teenager.
It's so
like
sad.
The mom in me was like, oh, that poor kid.
Yeah. I was like, no, don't make him do anything. Protect baby.
Well, they really use that to their advantage. They show his inner conflict. Like, you know, there are only two other people who are fighting off a whole baseball team full of zombies. And, you know, so he is really paralyzed with this decision of what do I do? Can I really attack them even though I know it's not really them? Like, it looks like them. And this is something I can do. Yeah.
Right. And, like, I think in this way, these zombie friends are kind of part of the setting of this story of, like, of this car. This is the setting. This is what the setting is presenting as your conflict. So yeah, you want your setting to be dynamic and have it impact your plot in a meaningful way. Remember, for the most part, plot and conflict are the same thing. And I know we say this a lot, and it's definitely more nuanced than that. They're not exactly the same thing. But just remember that conflict and plot are practically synonyms in everything I've kind of said here. So your setting should impact both in very, very similar ways because they're kind of the same thing.
Right.
Anyway, that's just a little aside because I like to remind people that I tend to use them interchangeably.
Yeah. I'm just sitting here thinking about the poor baseball player and the zombie baseball players.
I didn't mean to bring that up.
It's so sad.
It's okay. It's okay. None of
that's
them
honestly
made it
my
out.
biggest. That's honestly my biggest problem with a lot of horror is that I can't be scared and sad at the same time. That's like too emotionally overwhelming for me. So like as long as I'm just scared, it's fine. But when it goes into like sad territory too, then that's too much for me. So
This whole movie was very sad. Are you okay?
It was. Yeah, I'm okay. It was so gory that like you can't really feel too sad about it because it's so gross. So one issue I see frequently with setting, and I'm sure you do too, Carly, is setting either being described way too much or not enough.
Yes.
There's this like Goldilocks sweet spot that's just right. And until you learn how to see it on your own, it can feel really elusive. Part of what I really liked about the setting in this movie is how minimalist, like visually minimalist, a lot of the physical locations are. So like the train itself is a commuter train, so it's not like especially fancy or anything.
There is like one very fancy car though. The one at the end. Just
Right.
say. Continue.
And then the train stations are also like pretty modern and sparsely decorated or whatever. They're not especially fancy either. But what that means is that the eye is really drawn to what's happening in the background. Like we're not looking at a lot of like visual details of the setting so that you can really pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the background. And the filmmakers really use that to their advantage. I'm really thinking of when they pull into one train station and see all the people running from the zombies and like zombies getting people to, of course, the absolute horror of the people on the train. But there's this moment as they first pull up where the passengers on the train are still sort of in a scene and it takes them a couple seconds to recognize what's going on outside. But because of the positioning of the camera, the viewer gets to recognize it before they do, which of course adds to the horror for the viewer. And what I think is so brilliant about this movie, about using this movie to think about how you describe your settings, is that it doesn't focus on a lot on the things that the viewer will find commonplace. And instead it puts the emphasis on the things unique to the story, like the zombies and the big empty train station. So we talk a lot on here about thinking about what your reader will be bringing to the story and using that knowledge to play with their expectations. So this is another area where it's helpful to consider what your reader is bringing to the story. So, for example, your reader will probably have a good idea of what a train station looks like, even if they're a country bumpkin like me, just because of other media. So you don't really need to go into a lot of detail describing that. Ask yourself what your reader will and won't know based on sort of the collective consciousness of pop culture. So, that means you want to consider not just other books, but also movie, TV shows, all of those kinds of things. And then use that as a foundation to build on. The other element of this is using the character's actions to work in setting descriptions. So I often call this breadcrumbs. I've heard you calling it peppering it in or sprinkling it in, Carly.
Peppering it in, yep.
Where you add small amounts of description throughout a scene for the reader to pick up and kind of create a larger mental picture of what the setting is like. So, for example, as a character walks through a scene, don't just describe what they see. Show them glance at something over the shoulder of a character that they're talking to. Describe the sound the floor or the ground makes as they walk over it. Those kinds of small details are the perfect credbrums
Yep.
to build that bigger picture in the minds of your reader.
I love to eat credbrums. All right, so how do you decide on your setting? I'm going to go back to my tree map analogy here. It was very clearly perfect, and I have no notes for myself on that. So, you want to start big. What country, even world, and time does your story take place in? If you're writing fantasy or sci-fi, this could be a completely different world from our own. But once you figure out the world, you'll then kind of figure out the country, the city, etc., etc. So, where in the world do we start, Carmen Sandiego? And at the same time, figure out your time period. What cultures are present in those locations and times, etc., etc. You're kind of all the stuff we've talked about so far. Then we get into the scene settings. Does the scene take place in one location? What building? What room? What is in that room that would affect the plot? So how can the set dressing impact your characters and the conflict? And then ask yourself what the setting reflects in your characters. So the obvious one here is when we're in your character's bedroom. What does their room say about them? But even when your character is in a completely random location, how they interact and react with the setting is going to tell readers a lot about who they are. I know I've said this before, but if your character walks into a room and notices certain titles on a bookshelf, that's going to tell us a lot about the character, who they are, that they're a book nerd, or possibly that they're judgmental, or maybe they had a bad experience one time when they were literally sucked into a book and they fought with the hero. I don't know, I'm getting off topic again, but back to the tree map. So kind of once you figure out this big picture setting, you can then work down to the scene by scene settings. It's going to include not only the rooms and objects in that room, but also the different culture, privileges, and limitations of all of these places. So you'll need to ask yourself if you need a certain object present in a scene, what can you show, or who is your character, and how can you show who they are through the setting? Yeah. Basically, you can use setting to push readers kind of into the body of your main character by imposing different societal limitations on them even. So basically, setting influences and interacts with every element of your story. So you need to choose it with extreme intention. It's kind of easy to fall into the trap of, this place is cool, so that's where my story takes place, and not really think about the repercussions of that setting on the characters and the conflict, as well as like the meaning behind that setting. So So choose very wisely and with intent.
Yeah. I feel like we say that a lot too.
Yeah. We should just, intent, I think, is like our mantra.
Yeah. It's like our, mantra.
Yeah. The
what
word
you said.
Yeah. I chose that word with intent.
Yeah. So something else to consider with setting is how you're using it to enhance the mood, tone, tension, conflict, and the emotions of the characters. So essentially subtext. How are you using setting to create like another set of meaning, like Carly was saying, that is sort of beneath or underlying the obvious of what's happening in a scene. So this is something authors often do unintentionally anyway. But when you do it with intent, it can make such a difference for a story. And so horror is really great at this. So like sort of a classic example is using darkness and gloom to make it harder to see so that the characters and the viewer can't see what's coming. And of course, when you can't see what's coming and you know there's something scary out there, it just makes it that much scarier. Mm-hmm. In this movie, the fact that the train is moving adds tremendously to the tension, and that wouldn't be possible in a lot of settings. Mm-hmm. It also gives them this built-in way to move from one location to another, and also a reason to like slow down and speed up as they move into different stations. So those are natural ways to play with the tension, all of those things. It's really almost too on the nose too, but the scene that Carly described a minute ago with all the characters moving through the train, there's like this very emotionally dark moment for them, when they get into this car that's populated with the most zombies and they're just exhausted and they're like, we don't know if we can do it. Mm-hmm. And then that's when they have this visual darkness of going into a tunnel. And it still has this kind of twist for the movie, even though it is, like I said, it is almost too on the nose that, it's emotionally dark and it's visually dark. But then it gives this twist of them learning that the zombies sort of lose all sense of what's going on around them when they're in the dark.
The darkness
so it serves
gives
the
hope.
function in the story as well. What was that?
The darkness gives hope.
Yeah. And so it does create this nice little parallel, though. And so when you're deciding where a scene should take place, consider what's appropriate for the emotional content of the scene. So, like, romantic scenes are also great examples of this. There's often soft lighting, a location that affords some amount of privacy.
Or not.
Those are sort of, or not, yeah. But those are sort of extreme examples to make a point. But you can do this in any scene. Just think about what the different sensory experiences are of a particular location. What will they bring to that scene? And how those elements will naturally impact your characters. And then use that to your advantage to really take the emotions of any scene to the next level.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I think we did it.
I think we did. We said setting and place so many times.
And intent. We got intent in there, so that's good for us.
That could be like some kind of game.
A drinking
like
game?
Every time. Yeah, maybe a drinking game or something
Or
else.
like a sugar game. I don't know. Yeah. People could place bets on how many times we're going to say it in the next episode.
Definitely.
I think that's fun.
So our query this month is an adult dark fantasy, which is one of my favorite genres. Mm-hmm. So Carly, what are your thoughts on this query?
So this story actually sounds really interesting to me. I like the main plot and the multiple genres it's kind of pulling from. It has a really fun crossover with that. But I think it could use like more personality. That's not the exact word I'm going for. Maybe it's theme or setting. We've just said setting and place and stuff so much that my brain's a little fuzzy full of it. But basically, it all feels like kind of a little too generic in the beginning. We aren't getting a sense of who your character is and why we should care about her. She's kind of thrown into a mystery, but what is at stake for her on a more personal, intimate level? We're missing like the internal tension and conflict, which is what draws people into your query. So you cover the plot pretty okay, but by the end, when you kind of lay the stakes out fully, we don't have that emotional connection to your character to really care. So you basically want to up the emotional connection to the character by digging into that internal conflict and who they are. And pepper, in some fun kind of setting elements that are going to show what makes this story so special. Because when I got to that last paragraph, I was like, oh yeah, that's cool. I get it now. But until then, I was kind of missing all those special elements.
Yeah, there are a few elements here that definitely pique my interest. It's historical. There's a large mystery element with a female sleuth. But the finer details feel kind of vague. I'm not, by the end of the query, I'm not 100% sure what actually happens in this story, other than just having a mystery in it. And the author mentioned some real life historical events in that final paragraph, which is, I think, what you were alluding to. But It isn't clear to me what the connection is to the plot as described in the query. So I definitely think one part of the problem is that the sentences are all pretty long and have similar structures. So even in a query letter, you want varied sentence length and structure to keep variety and keep the reader engaged. And also, don't be afraid to give more details. This is something I see a lot in queries where the author wants to create a sense of mystery around the story by having this strong hook, so they leave out important details. So if you are listening to this right now, I want you to write this down. Details in a query don't spoil anything.
Yes.
They get us more excited for the unique elements of your story. And so depending on the story and how much of a twist it has, you can sometimes give details as far in as like just before the climax without spoiling too much. Obviously, you don't want to give the ending away. That would spoil too much. Away.
Yes.
Yeah, but you can really go pretty far into your story to really show what the conflict and stakes are. So yeah, just don't be afraid of the details.
I think that's exactly right. All right, so next month, we'll be watching the Disney movie whose songs are stuck in absolutely everybody's head, Encanto.
We will be talking about Bruno.
We will talk about Bruno. I've woken up with that song stuck in my head every day last week. It was the worst.
Right.
Anyway, so I'm looking forward to doing that again. We will also have another query or blur critique. So if you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can support the show and get extra content at patreon.com/storychatradio. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at storychatradio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.